Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. So today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alex Mayhew. Alex is an assistant professor in modern European history at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He previously taught at the University of Birmingham, running their MA in First World War Studies, a course that was delivered here at the National Army Museum. Today he will be discussing the ways that ordinary soldiers on the Western Front viewed the First World War and their place within the conflict. So there will be time for questions at the end, both in person and online. So if you're online, you can post those questions in our Q&A chat bar. At the end, put your hand up and I'll come around with the microphone. Moving on to some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you if you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass over to Alex to begin the talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, it's really nice to be back at the National Army Museum. I'm going to be talking about my book project, and it's actually possibly true that it would probably exist without the National Army Museum, but it wouldn't look the way it does without the collections here. And in fact, it starts with a reference to a collection of letters written by a soldier to his son in London, which really sparked my ideas around how soldiers make sense of conflict and the ways they try and navigate it. That being said, currently, as many of you will be aware, academic books are quite expensive. So I don't recommend you buy it currently at the current price. But it will be released in April or May at around £30. So if you do find today's talk interesting, please do go ahead and buy it at that point. But I wouldn't want to impose a new mortgage on anybody in the room at this point. When we talk about conflict, when we talk about the experience of conflict, historians who are interested in the way that we study people's experience and response to extraordinary events tend to talk about three things. We could call them the three C's. Right? So we either talk about consent and how people consent to the extraordinary. We talk about coercion, how people are coerced to interact with or abide by an extraordinary situation. And the other thing we talk about is compliance. So our propensity as humans to comply with the abnormal and the horrible. And in fact, I would argue that that's possibly the most profound part of human history, is our ability to comply even in the most extraordinary of circumstances, which is perhaps a warning for the future. But ultimately, we can't really distinguish between those three things. We consent in some ways, we're coerced in others, and we eventually comply depending on how we perceive the world around us. And so what I'm going to be talking about today, and maybe to keep that in mind as I talk, is how these three things influence how individuals make the world rationally accountable to themselves. So essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is how people make sense of war. And I'm going to do so by talking you through my project, hopefully in not dreary or boring detail. I'll try and keep it exciting because it is a Friday lunchtime. I'm sure people's stomachs will be grumbling at some point. I'm going to talk about the project. I'm going to talk about my research and the concepts. I'll keep it light on concepts. And then I'll try and give you a sense of the arguments in my book through 5 locations before I talk about what I'm going to argue is the crisis in morale amongst British soldiers, particularly English soldiers on the Western Front, which is in 1917 and 1918. To start, though, I'll just give you a sense of the kind of questions I'm interested in, because otherwise what I'm going to say isn't necessarily going to make sense. So I'm interested in how combatants endured the Great War. More generally speaking, I'm interested in how individuals make sense of times of crisis and trauma. The First War was kind of my case study for doing that. An associated question is really what underpinned morale. And morale is a heavily studied subject. I'll give you a sense of what people have said about that in a second. But I think maybe sometimes we've asked the wrong questions about it. An associated question is how do people experience crisis? Because the First World War was a crisis. It emerged in crisis spirals. it enveloped in crisis spirals and it ended in crisis spirals. But what did that mean to individuals, and how did they navigate those things? And then lastly, kind of the more focused question, which perhaps is of interest to some of the people in the room today and online, is, was there a crisis of morale in the British Expeditionary Force between 1914 and 1918? I've already hinted that I think there was, and I've already hinted it's in 1917, 1918. And underpinning all of that is the question of how do combatants make sense of war? Because they were regularly confronted by sites like the one you can see on screen, an abandoned German trench at Devil Wood. How do you make sense of that kind of environment, and how do you survive it? Because I guess sitting here today in Chelsea, that's something that's quite hard to comprehend. So what about the research? As I mentioned, I used the National Army Museum's archives in the collections here, also used the Imperial War Museum's archives, several local regimental museums. And in particular, as somebody interested in how people make sense of the war, I was looking at things like letters, diaries, postcards, which were a very popular way for particularly working class individuals to interact with people at home and also their friends. They also collected them, but also things like signature books. I'm also interested in trying to trace morale over time, because morale isn't static, it changes. And it changes both demographically, and we know the British Army moved from being an army of predominantly regulars and reservists through to one of volunteers, through to one of conscripts. So we'd probably expect morale to shift in that sense, and in the ways that individuals make sense to shift of the war to shift as well. I looked at soldiers' newspapers. If anyone has ever looked at these, they're fascinating windows on how soldiers communicated the war to each other. I also looked at war diaries, reports, memos, cabinet papers, and committee reports. So I'm really trying to embrace morale in its full spectrum. Beyond that, I also focused on English regiments. So the British Army at this time kind of reflected the British nation, a four-nation nation. And it would be very difficult to unpick the very complex national identities of the Irish, Scots, Welsh, and English in their entirety. So I decided I'd focus on English regiments. And as many of you will know, the British Army spoke to regional identities underpinning Englishness and Britishness at this time. So infantry regiments frequently recruited from and built their identities around a county or series of counties. So I chose 6. The Border Regiment, to give me a sense of kind of the north of England. The Devonshire Regiment, so the southwest. The Manchester Regiment, to get a sense of Lancashire and the urban north, and the industrial north, I should say. The Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The Royal Fusiliers, who at least at the beginning of the war predominantly recruited from London, but expanded beyond being a purely regional regiment by the end of the war. And the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. The reason I did this is, I would argue, and I've got a quotation here, is that in the British Army, esprit de corps, which is an essential part of morale, focused on the peculiarities of the regimental system. And this isn't a new thing to say, but it's important to remember. Because this helped to foster an allegiance to an imagined place of origin that stressed not just regimental and battalion history and traditions, but bound men to a sense of a shared past and, importantly, to a particular place. And that place might be Buckinghamshire or it might be a region. And it's important to remember this because despite the demographic shifts that took place in the British Army and some assumptions that have emerged around like the kind of distillation of regional identities at the time, they remained really important. Most regiments serving in Belgium and France and overseas during the First World War were able to maintain a rough regional homogeneity, especially those from urban areas. So even as the needs for manpower expanded and changed, historians have shown that actually new systems for recruitment were often built around command districts that drew on regions. So even by 1918, despite the losses incurred, units still had a strong regional core and a strong regional identity. And that's important to remember, especially when we study morale. There is a question we need to ask, though, which is, what is morale? I could talk about this for the whole of this session. I don't want to, because it would probably bore you. So I'm going to give you the most used quotation, which is from Jonathan Fennell, a historian of the Second World War. which is morale is the willingness of an individual or group to prepare for or to engage in an action required by an authority or an institution. So really we're thinking about why men were willing to conform to the British Army during the war. And historians and social scientists have highlighted myriad factors that underpin morale. You can see here they range from institutional factors through to social factors, to individual factors, but also the economic, cultural world, environmental world, and also situational things like rumours. There tend to be seen to be 4 pillars of morale. One is small group theory, so the power of a small group, a platoon, a section, a company, in maintaining unit cohesion. Ideology, so that might be nationalism, it might be patriotism, or just a belief in the cause. Also negative factors, so coercion, discipline, things like that. And then training. So Hugh Strawn in particular has suggested that training is kind of the key distinguishing factor between armies' performance across the 20th century. There are a variety of themes that sit under these pillars, and morale as a result is often studied as a series of inputs, so how does an army maintain morale, and a series of outputs, so how do we measure morale, how do we judge the efficacy of those inputs. But one thing I want to highlight is I think that kind of misses a key feature of this, which is that morale is also a process that exists in the minds of soldiers, whether or not they're cognizant of it. So I would like to suggest that morale isn't just a series of inputs and outputs. It's not just what Jonathan Fennell has suggested, but it's also a process through which servicemen positively or negatively rationalize their role as soldiers and constructive members of the military. And there are a few reasons for this, but we need to remember that individuals, even in an institution which tries to enforce its will upon its members, are still agents and still have worldviews. And that's where psychology is really important. These are people who are trying to make sense of the world around them. And there are a variety of different things that we could study here. What I've put on the board, I'm not going to talk you through all of it, are factors that underpin resilience. And human resilience is a key part of the story of morale. It's a key part of the story of warfare. In fact, warfare is perhaps one of the most vibrant windows onto the inherent resilience of humans. There are a variety of things we could study here. Positive thinking, spiritual coping through belief, religion, deploying positive emotions, the climate of command, the cohesion one feels with one's unit or beyond it. But the really important thing here that I want to highlight is a lot of this rests on unconscious and instinctive responses to situations. So we have to accept when we're studying morale, when we're studying soldiers' experiences of war, that much of this is hard to unpick. And we need to embrace other disciplines, in particular psychology, but things like sociology, if we're really going to understand the gray areas and how people make sense of the world around them. There are 2 other things that I think we need to embrace. Firstly, understanding the culture, not just of the military, but of the society that produces that military, and something called sense-making. So culture is really essential in this. So culture depends, according to Stuart Hall, on its participants interpreting meaningfully what is around them and making sense of the world in broadly similar ways. It's important to remember that because I know you are all people with an interest in the First World War, so probably this doesn't apply to you, but popular perceptions of the war still pivot around the idea that this was a futile, pointless experience and conflict. Now, people can't survive things if they perceive them in those ways. So we need to understand how they created meaningful, interpretive frameworks around the conflict. And sense-making is one of the concepts that helps me do that. So sense-making, according to some institutional theory, explains how we structure the unknown so as to be able to act in it and develop a plausible understanding, a map of a shifting world. So what I want to talk about going from this point on is the experience of crisis and how people created that plausible understanding, a map of the world around them on the Western Front. So I mentioned that the war was crisis, grew out of crisis, was driven by crisis, and ended in crisis. Now, traditionally, people think about crisis as an acute situation, a moment that requires decision or a response. But that is not how people live through events. Most people don't have the power to change the situations they're part of. And this is where considering crisis to be a chronic issue is really important. So, crisis can be a state of greater or lesser permanence, as in a longer or shorter transition towards something better or worse, or towards something altogether different. So an acute crisis for a soldier might be a bombardment, an attack, an assault, a trench raid. But their daily lives were plagued by chronic issues. So dislocation from home, the omnipresence of death and the loss of comrades, the danger, the destruction, issues of time and the sense that time isn't moving, military discipline, discomfort, boredom, all of these things are chronic issues that they have to cope with. So we need to understand how they respond to acute crises, but it's really important when we study the experience of a war, like the war on the Western Front, that we study how they endure chronic issues. And that's because of the peculiarity of the Western Front as a theatre of war. I don't need to explain the Western Front to most of you. We've got a map here, but I just want to speak about its peculiar character. In fact, the character that often leads people to assume that it was pointless or futile. It was a predominantly static war, yes, but this is an important part of the story. The length of the British presence there meant that they left an imprint of themselves in places behind the lines. They transformed places, they renamed them. They occupied particular parts of the Western Front for nearly 4 years and built new and lasting relationships and new infrastructure. The landscapes also weren't entirely alien. This is very close to Britain. It doesn't look as dramatically different as the landscapes that soldiers in Mesopotamia, in Africa, in the Middle East were encountering. And there was a rapid flow of information from home back and forth across the English Channel. It's also not all about trenches. Recent research into the 1st through 4th divisions show that actually between 1914 and 1918, units spent only about 46% of their time in the front lines. And only about 20% of that was fighting. And by fighting, I don't mean combat like you'd have seen at the Somme. That's, a bombardment. Beyond that, they're in rest camps, they're in billets, they're in towns, they're in training camps. And even at the front, between a quarter and half of their time was spent in reserve billets or rest camps several miles behind the trenches. And they were rotated around these places. So they were slowly exposed to parts of the line that allowed them to normalize and become connected to the Western Front in ways that more mobile fronts would have never allowed. And that's something that I think is unique and worth remembering. Just to give you a sense of the everyday experience of the soldiers, and I mentioned chronic issues were the things that kind of dictated their everyday experiences. I've got here a unique example of a soldier that was failing to cope, but his experiences would have resonated with those of his comrades who were perhaps more resilient. In his diary towards the end of 1916, I should mention that this man, Ernest Mahler, was a conscript. He was in his 30s, so he was quite old for a soldier. He'd been a butler in London, so he was used to cleanliness and authority. It's not what he had when he arrived. And he was shocked by what he encountered. The drizzling rain, it was a horrible, dirty place. There were puddles of mud. There were foul houses and old buildings, some absolutely unfit for human beings to occupy. There was no work to do at times, which got on his nerves. It was cold, wet, and windy. He was bored of the same routine. He was upset by how the comfort of home had been in his thoughts because it was such a contrast with his present. To quote him here, the life out here is hell, no comfort of cleanliness. May God soon send peace, he wrote at the end of that diary entry. On the 3rd of November, awful puddle underfoot. The food seems like poison to me. There are vile smells. How I wish it would all end. I long for the comfort of home. I like this last bit. A horrible goat here, which stinks out the whole place. 14th of November, he's talking about burying the dead. So witnessing the death of one's comrades or one's citizens was horrible to him. Long trenches about 200 yards, 4 foot deep, poor fellows simply sewn into a blanket. How awful. 13th of December. Wicked billet, no fire, no comfort. billet as a rotten loft, dark, stinks, enormous amount of waste in the army. And then on the 1st of January 1917, New Year's Day, may God send peace in 1917. Now, he is unique in his, as far as my research has shown, in his inability to adapt. I think age plays a big part. But these are the conditions that every one of his comrades had to deal with. That being said, it's also worth thinking about where historians have highlighted particular and peculiar crises in the history of the British Expeditionary Force. And this is what I built my book around, is trying to study each of the moments I'm about to describe. And the first one is winter 1914. So this is really about the resilience of the British Expeditionary Force regular units. And traditionally, there's been a myth that's kind of grown up around the history of the old Contemptibles, that it was the best organized, best equipped, best trained army to ever have gone to war. However, historians have, over recent past, questioned that narrative which emerges from the official histories. So the battles of Mons and Lecato have seen in a more negative light than they once were. Gary Sheffield has argued that this was actually the right army for a different sort of war than it came to fight. Reservists, we need to remember, had brought nominally regular units up to strength, but had been left with little time to readjust the army, learn the procedures of army life, relearn new tactics, whatever it might have been, and this seems to have undermined confidence. There were also institutional problems that plagued the regular army at this time. The quality of generalship should and has been questioned in 1914 and 1915 as well. The tactics have been questioned. Procedures of command and control left a lot to be desired. And there are also serious deficiencies in manpower and materiel, which affected the morale of soldiers. It's for this reason that the historian Alexander Watson has suggested that this might have actually been the crisis in morale for the British Army. He points to higher levels of self-inflicted wounds amongst the regulars and reservists, high levels of surrendering, high levels of psychological collapse. So his argument is that 1914 was the major crisis in morale, particularly growing out of a shock at the length and nature of the war, and also from poor preliminary training. He also suggests, and others have suggested, that the resilience of this particular version of the BEF might have undermined by it being particularly prominently staffed by society's most disadvantaged men. However, what I would suggest is that many of the people that I've studied didn't experience this as a period of crisis, or they didn't understand it to be. I think statistics are hard to unpick with real effectiveness. And if you look at the way they make sense of their world, they might not have been happy about the length of the war or the nature of the conflict. They did retain a belief in victory and the ability of the British Army to engineer victory at the end of 1914. So I'm not entirely on board with Alexander Watson's analysis. The second crisis moment, which has often been pointed to by historians and scholars, is the end of 1916. And this really is talking about the end of the Battle of the Somme and what might have been a widespread malaise and depression that emerged with the failure of this great offensive to bring about peace. Historians have pointed to the difficulties of training large numbers of volunteers, continued problems of supplies and logistics, meaning that units were trained without inadequate arms or inadequate tactics, often directed by officers with limited experience. John Keegan actually described this as an army of bands of uninformed, or uniformed, I should say, innocents. Tim Travers and others have pointed to an increasingly fragile spirit within the British Army at this time. That being said, most historians would now agree that actually we should view this in a more positive light. There were tactical developments during the Battle of the Somme that engendered a confidence in British troops that actually they were marching on the right path towards victory. In fact, Gary Sheffield and others have pointed to the fact that the Somme campaign sees soldiers ending with an increased confidence in their own military capabilities. They were bolstered by those tactical innovations. They were bolstered by evidence of Allied materiel superiority, which was emerging by this point as industry at home had been mobilized, and also by the sight of German prisoners. Now, that doesn't mean that fatigue wasn't setting in, but alongside the humor of the Tommies, there is a sense that they were resilient and that they believed they were treading a path towards peace. That doesn't mean they didn't hope for peace, but they saw it as a likely victorious peace. And the reasons for fighting were still supported by their perceptions of the world around them. The greater crisis then, and this points to what I've already said, is perhaps the third moment that historians have often pointed to, which is winter 1917 through to spring 1918. This pivots actually around kind of some unsophisticated analyses of conscripts, but realistically what we're looking at here is the after effects of fighting at Passchendaele, fighting at Cambrai, and a very bleak strategic picture internationally. The Italians have collapsed, the Russians have collapsed, the Americans are a long way away. So it seems like morale was really low in 1917, end of 1917 and early 1918. What is evidence of this? Well, one of the points we can look at is the collapse of the British Army, or the Fifth Army in particular, in the face of the German spring offensives on the 21st of March 1918. Historians have pointed to instances of panic and disordered retreat, highlighting perhaps a fragile spirit amongst British soldiers. We shouldn't, though, discount the effectiveness of things like German infiltration tactics and the fact that units often only surrendered when they were surrounded. And indeed, we should question how much we can learn from statistics around things like surrendering, given the fact this was often a rational choice based on one's desire to survive. Historians have suggested that morale was actually in a process of rehabilitation in the lead up to the spring offensives, and that by the spring offensives themselves, morale had actually come to some sort of higher level. However, I think the thing that I was drawn to is David Stevenson's argument that actually the rehabilitation of morale and the restoration of it comes after the spring offensives. So that's something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is why it might be that the spring offensives themselves, slightly counterintuitively, are the things that re-engender morale. The thing to remember here, though, is that 1917 left men questioning the path to victorious peace. They no longer believed that battle was something that could achieve that. So why is it that spring 1918 actually forestalled that and maybe rehabilitated it? I'll come back to that in a second. So I just want to talk about the key arguments. If we go back to needing to endure chronic crisis. And there are a few of these, and I'm going to kind of explain them through a series of locations first. But I'll give you an outline. Firstly, my argument is that morale and perceptions of crisis were conditioned by soldiers' environment, the Western Front, their social groups, both the army and people at home, and their own psychological apparatus. Their daily life, I would suggest, focused on enduring chronic crisis and mobilizing the resources to do so. Here, I think we need to embrace and understand the power of human psychological resilience, something innate to us, not nationally specific, especially processes of what psychologists call habituation and normalization. So habituation is our ability to kind of reduce the negative impact of stimuli. So that might be fear created by a bombardment. The more we're exposed to those things, often the less scary, the less depressing they might be. And also our ability to normalize horrific things. And that's something that echoes through time and space. Morale and endurance, I argue as well, it was buttressed by soldiers' attachment to the Western Front. It became a meaningful space by their relationships with home and the ways that those relationships with home also bolstered their sense of duty. Ultimately, and I've already hinted at this too, it was their hope for and their belief in victorious peace and the future that was fundamental. As long as soldiers believed that victory was likely and that the army and battle was the most likely thing to achieve that, they were willing to sacrifice almost anything. And in 1917, 1918, as I'll mention again in a second, we see the crisis of BEF morale. Ultimately, what hopefully I'm going to show in the next few slides is that perception and perspective, and soldiers' perceptions and perspectives, actually shape events. So the first location I want to talk about is British Base Camp Number 1 at Le Havre on the coast of the English Channel. Now, Number 1, Base Camp Le Havre was basically in British hands, and as was the town, from 1914 all the way through to 1919, with a brief gap during the feared German invasion of France in 1914. And what these locations can tell us about is how time behind the lines was a defining part of the soldiers' experiences of the Western Front. It also helps us understand how these were British or in cases, imperial spaces. Soldiers who arrived on ships in Le Havre would often comment on the fact that this seemed like an English or a British town. The only reason they realized it wasn't was because it said cafe above the estaminets. It was a place for recreation, rest, and recuperation. All of these things are essential if you're going to maintain morale. Soldiers spent weeks here. They could go swimming in the sea. There were opportunities for tourism to go explore local sites of historical significance. There are important battlefields from British and English history that weren't far away, and the army would create little leaflets that would help soldiers go and explore them. So if you wanted to go see the Battle of Crécy, you could go and do that. There were places to go watch sports. So the Royal Garrison Artillery at Le Havre kept a team of talented professional footballers from teams like Chelsea that you could go and watch. There were theatres, there were cinemas. These were places for provisioning and logistics. Many troops never left these places as well, which is something to remember. We don't study the experience of auxiliary troops in enough detail, but they're essential for the war. As I've talked about in other parts of my writing, there were even vegetable shows at the base camp in Le Havre. They had huge allotment gardens where they tried to invest their time in things that weren't related to the war. So what we can find if we look at places like this is the importance of things like normalization, of rest, of recreation, and the ability to imbue the war with broader meaning, because training also gave people skills for the future. And when soldiers left the British Army, they often left with a character certificate or a reference, which they'd take to a job, which would talk about all of the things they'd learned whilst they were in khaki. And their performance was often fed back to them. So we need to look at these spaces if we're really going to understand the experience of the war in its broadest sense. That being said, we can't ignore the front lines when we're talking about this, particularly when we're thinking about infantrymen. So the environment could be normalized. It was a space for exploration, but it was also a place that plagued morale and nurtured a sense of crisis. Sometimes this was weather-related. Winter was often the biggest foil for men's misery. It was seen as the worst time, even worse than battle in some instances. But also, they were places where one was reminded of the omnipresence of destruction and death. And what I've got here is Ridgewood in Belgian Flanders, and a quotation from a letter by Paul Nash, the famous war artist, to his wife in 1917. And I'll read it out. In a wood, passed through on our way up, a place with an evil name, pitted and pocked with shells, the trees torn to shreds, often reeking with poison gas, a most desolate and ruinous place 2 months back. But today, it was a vivid green. The most broken trees even had sprouted somewhere in the midst. From the depth of the wood's bruised heart poured the throbbing song of a nightingale. Ridiculous, mad incongruity. So these were places where soldiers could find solace, and nature was often a point of solace. They would look at the sky, they'd watch birds, they'd take joy in the fact that spring would lead to sprouting shrubs, because it gave them a sense that time was still moving forward. But importantly too, these were places that became symbolic of the cause, because they were places that became symbolic of people's comrade sacrifice. Cemeteries littered the Western Front, totally littered it. So in this spot now, there are 292 Canadian graves, 280 British graves and Irish graves, 40 Australians, 3 New Zealanders, and 2 Germans. A frontline cemetery was established here as early as 1915 and was fought over through the German offensives. So what I'm trying to say here is there were ways that soldiers could seek solace in the front lines, but actually these were also places where cemeteries became emblematic of this being a land that had seen British blood or imperial blood shed on it. There was a reason to fight for it. And they talk about this constantly during the spring offensives. They don't want to relinquish places that had become so emblematic of the cause and of their sacrifice. The Western Front could become emblematic in other ways too. And here I've got 2 locations. Ypres, which will be familiar to all of you, I'm sure, and a place called Atier. Soldiers felt a deep sense of duty and felt that there was a justice in their cause. One thing we need to remember is that, for the most part, British soldiers did believe that Germany needed to be defeated. They believed that the Kaiser, and German Kultur as it was called, was something that was an evil presence in the world. And the landscapes that they witnessed became evidence of this. So Ypres, as you'll know, was an important strategic site, witnessed 4 major battles across the war. And the city and the salient around it not only became a tomb in the same way as we've seen the cemeteries in the front lines, it saw actually 1.2 million casualties across the war. But it was also a place where the destruction of history symbolized the aggressiveness of the enemy. Soldiers regularly talked about how it was such a terrible thing to see the destruction of antiquity, and how this was evidence of German brutality. So it was a tomb, and it was a symbolic place representing the evil German vampire, as it was often called, they were often called in postcards of Ypres. Attier provided a similar symbolic moment. Attier was captured by the 9th Scottish Division in April 1917 as the Germans relinquished land on their retreat back to the Hindenburg Line. For those of you that know about this, the Germans also employed a scorched earth policy once they did this. And witnessing the destruction of churches, the poisoning of wells, the killing of livestock, soldiers were reminded of the apparent devilishness of their enemy as they saw homes destroyed, civilians forced into exodus, and the callous slaughter of livestock. So again, as the soldiers advanced, they found further evidence of the justice of their cause. What I'm trying to say here is that landscape and place was symbolic in sense-making. The Western Front was not just the canvas and cause of soldiers' suffering, it was a space that informed their perception of duty as well. Lastly, I've got something that I think symbolizes some other features of soldiers' sense-making: home, esprit de corps, and morale. Some of you might have visited Devonshire Cemetery, which is near Mametz. This was first built after the battles of 1st July 1916 by the survivors of the 8th and 9th Battalions of the Devonshire Regiment. They buried 13 officers and 148 comrades in 2 trenches. They surrounded it with barbed wire to kind of subvert the martial purpose. But more importantly, they requested that they would be given seeds of flowers from Devon, so they could essentially renationalize the landscape around their dead forebears. And this is one of the things I want to highlight, is despite this being a new army unit, the power of local identity was something that underpinned many men's experience of the Western Front. Not only that, but they were creating communities of the dead across the various groups that fought in these regiments. Wooden crosses or bottles would become symbolic places that soldiers would go. They'd often tend to the cemeteries. And these also contain specific visions of the nation. Battalions would often create journals and newspapers which contain those pictures. And those were sustaining in and of themselves. What we can see here isn't just the symbolic spaces that were created on the Western Front, but how local and regional identities, the ability to imagine home, the power of esprit de corps, and social networks that extended over time and space were also essential to sense-making and morale. I want to talk about 2 further things before I outline why 1917 and 1918 was a crisis. And one of them links to what I've just discussed. It's soldiers' ability to imagine home. Home was the key feature of their sense-making and their sense of duty. I've got a wonderful quotation, sorry, National Army Museum, it's from the Imperial War Museum, from William Anderson in a letter in November 1916. And he said in a letter to his wife, "I often picture our house in my mind, and many a time I fancy my spirit, if this is not too fanciful, wanders through the rooms. In my mind I can see you during the evenings by the fire, and I wonder when you go to bed, and then fancy you lying down, you awake as usual. It's funny at times what you get thinking about." Soldiers had a real sense of their own identities, but this pivoted around what I have in other places described as the implicit nation. I think patriotism is important, but we need to remember that soldiers' sense of their own identities and what they were fighting for pivoted around emotive places and spaces that often linked far more to their family, friends, and locality than it did to abstract senses of the state, government, Westminster, liberty, whatever these things might have been written about in literary circles. And also they related flexibly to the United Kingdom. And in a sense, they were more liable to shift and reform in response to the war's changing features. What I'm trying to say is that I think relationships like this with home were less liable to change as the war dragged on than a political identity might have otherwise been. The other thing about this is that they also offered spaces that soldiers could retreat into to escape their present. Their memories were really important. And those memories often provided a genuine positive cocoon that helped them survive in times of trauma. Soldiers are constantly flying off into their dreams whilst they're staring at the sky in trenches, or when they're staring into a fire, or when they're sleeping. And they really, really embrace that. And sometimes even just conversations with friends, newspapers sent from home also offered an opportunity to do this. Novels, they often bought novels that had a particular link to a place that was relevant to them. The other thing that I've mentioned that's pivotal here is the psychology of hope. So hope is a cognitive function, it's goal-oriented, and it's affected by optimism and pessimism, but it's different to it. It's goal-directed. So positive illusions and optimistic reasoning support morale and support hopefulness. But ultimately, soldiers' willingness to invest themselves in a confidence in victorious peace was essential. Their hopefulness was key, and the ability of themselves and the army to nurture their hopefulness was really pivotal. So historians often said that soldiers' yearning for peace was evidence of low morale. That's not true. They were hoping for a particular form of peace. And it's only when the relationship between victory and peace became disassociated that morale suffered. And that's what happened in 1917 and 1918. So in this way, our understanding of morale has to account for soldiers' perceptions of time and the army's ability to nurture a confidence in the future. Just some qualifications that I think are worth making. I'm talking about British and English soldiers here, but if we were looking at the soldiers who came from wide parts of the British Empire, or even from the Dominions, we'd probably see something different. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But briefly to finish, why was 1917 and 1918 the crisis moment? I mentioned that 1916 actually ended quite optimistically, and 1917 began quite hopefully too. They ended 1916 confident they were treading a path towards victory. The early months of 1917 appeared to confirm this. So operations on the Anchor and the Somme saw minor victories, and also the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, even though that was a strategically prudent move, was seen as evidence that they were on the front foot, the British were on the front foot. They were also, though, being prepped for the idea that this would be a year of mobile warfare and further steps towards victory. Arras and Vimy Ridge and Messines Ridge all seem to suggest that too, but morale collapsed. And that was driven in part by Passchendaele and in part by the battle at Cambrai. Third Ypres was rightly remembered as a muddy, bloody, and seemingly futile tragedy fought over a wasteland of shell holes and saturated clay soils. Optimism was destroyed by this campaign, and it was destroyed men's faith in victory. Even though they eventually take Passchendaele Ridge, the gains were measured in bloody yards frequently, and the gains were also strategically not that important. Cambrai, ditto. An event that started so well with the ringing of bells across England because the successes were so huge, was counteracted by effective German counterattacks that pushed the British basically back to their starting point. Both of these battles seem to suggest to soldiers on the Western Front, alongside events elsewhere, the battle no longer was the key to securing victorious peace. Battle had its limits, and battle was something that possibly should be avoided. Worse still, the winter seems to confirm that the war was nowhere near ending. The British, strategically prudently, shift to the defensive and to a system of defense in depth. The problem there is for the troops that are being trained in that, a defensive strategy for 1918 is not going to secure peace by the end of the year. Every other year of the war, somewhat ironically given that 1918 is the end of the conflict on the Western Front, begins with them hoping that year will be the end of the conflict. 1918 does not happen in that way. They realize they're going to be fighting a defensive war. Worse still, preparing the lines for defensive warfare is tiring. They have less manpower, and they have less time to actually learn the tactics of defensive warfare. So they're tired, they no longer believe in battle, and they are no longer confident that the next year might bring peace. This all underpins what psychological and sense-making apparatus they go into early 1918 with. Why, though, is the German spring offensives a turning point? Soldiers were aware that these offensives were imminent. There was a sense of impending doom. And on the 21st of March, as you'll know, an immense German bombardment fell on British lines. It was a shock, but it wasn't necessarily a surprise. Operation Michiel fell on the 5th Army and 3rd Armies. The British Army lose over 170,000 men. They retreat nearly 40 miles. And then in April, the offensive shift to Flanders, and the British Army met these attacks, but they too were pushed back, though not as far. 9 miles, and they lose a further 80,000 men. However, along the way, despite commanders like Haig losing their faith in the defensive battles, soldiers are inflicting huge casualties on their enemy. They're seeing for the first time, really, slightly more open warfare. And they start to sense that there's been a shift in the pattern of the war. So even as they are retreating, they have a feeling that they're going to be able to strike back. And the war's entered a new phase. So somewhat paradoxically, the experience of retreat suggests that there might be a future for their offensive battles. And they actually fought well throughout these periods. And I would argue that the retreat isn't caused by a lack of faith or a lack of willingness or a lack of morale. It's actually caused by the lack of training that takes place in the winter period. So it's their inability to respond to acute crisis rather than their unwillingness to endure chronic crisis that explains the spring offensives and Britain's retreats during them. So just to conclude, because I'm getting a look from the back, morale was shaped by circumstances, perceptions, and surroundings. Social and environmental features were really important. I guess more broadly, if we're thinking about military history, in the military, armies need to help their service people endure chronic crises, and they need to equip them to respond to acute crisis. And the key part of this is hope and the resilience of hope. It's fundamental, and how do we ensure that soldiers retain and remain hopeful and hopefulness? I've got some just questions to throw out, which is humans are inherently resilient, but are we inherently violent? It's something that I've been grappling with as a historian of warfare. I'm also interested going forward in how imperial mindsets are learned and internalized on overseas service, because soldiers don't talk about the empire. It's not part of their sense-making. And I'm also interested what a multi-theater analysis of morale, looking at places like East Africa and sense-making and identity might reveal. And I'll finish up there. Thank you for listening.
Alex, if you go to your next slide, I know you've got information about your
book. Yeah,
book.
but as I said, please don't buy it. But in paperback is due to come out in spring 2025. If you want to take a small mortgage out, you can use that code at checkout on Cambridge University Press website, but you do not need to.